Good evening and a very warm welcome in Frascati, everybody, for the second half of what we have called the populist turn. My name is Ilko Bos van Rosenthal. I'll be moderating this event. About 2 hours ago we ended the first part with a focus on the East-West divide, Eastern European populism, Western European populism. We'll obviously talk a little bit about that right now, but we'll mostly focus on the way out of the polarized landscape, on solutions for populism, on the way the mainstream political parties have dealt with populism. Some very smart people on stage, so in about 2 hours the whole problem will be solved. Paul, the same question for you. Does populism for you always have this negative connotation or not necessarily?
Well, I see the ambivalence. I do agree that for me the starting point would be that it's trying to reinvent a sense of agency in an era of globalization. We're often told, for example, in the debate about migration, there's no alternative. Angela Merkel, every second phrase is alternatiefloos. So that is where it begins. People say we don't agree with the world as it is. We see, for example, that globalization produces more inequality, forms of alienation. We respond to that. That's where it begins. The ambivalence is, of course, that when there are no alternatives within the framework of a liberal democracy, these answers, these engagements, spill over into illiberal answers. And that is, of course, where your argument is very pertinent, that, of course, one sees the temptation of defining a population always in forms of exclusion, by defining the other, for sure. But the problem is, of course, that every sense of drawing borders and every community is a circle of solidarity that is defined, has its own limits. So how are we going to define a sense of community, nationally or in Europe, that is still within the boundaries of a liberal imagination? So we have left, I think, in many ways, the idea of defining communities in an inclusive, open way, saying it is impossible to answer these questions in an era of globalization. Boundaries evaporate, we're living in a limitless world, whereas many people are asking for a new imagination. So my search is, can you give this imagination, can you give answers to populism in a liberal vein? I think it is possible. But I add, it's only possible within the context of the European Union.
If I may, let me add one word about something that you, I think, brought up, but maybe that is worth underlining. I think it's been very tempting sometimes for opponents of populism to basically retreat to a position which, for shorthand, we might call technocratic. And I think that's also, the case with our great savior from populism, Macron. A lot of what he presents today sounds a little bit like a second coming of the third way. By which I mean a kind of attitude where somebody says, here's a reasonable center, which is also why Macron can say people from the left and the right can all join. It's not about partisanship. If you're reasonable, you can join this government. And then we have these crazy extremes, which of course, works well as an image in France. You can say Mélenchon is crazy and Le Pen is crazy too. But it's another way of telling people, if you don't support us, you're not reasonable. You're kind of irrational. That was even stronger, of course, during the Euro crisis, when many people simply said there is one correct solution to this. You mentioned the lovely German word, alternativlos. If you disagree with us, you reveal yourself to be irrational. That, of course, provides a fantastic opening for populists to say, what do you mean democracy without choices? Where are the people in this? It doesn't mean that populists, therefore, are the authentic defenders of democracy. I don't think they are. But they're going to be strengthened. And when they're strengthened, and this is how it basically becomes a vicious circle, if they're strengthened, technocrats are going to become even more technocratic, because they're going to say, look, you let people decide, they elect crazies. So let's take even more decision-making power away from them. And while it looks like we have two extremes here, in a certain way, they have one thing in common, because they're both forms of anti-pluralism. The technocrat says only one rational solution. If you disagree, you reveal yourself to be irrational. Populist says only one authentic will of the people. If you disagree with us, you reveal yourself to be a traitor to the people. And what's, in a sense, amazing about the Five Stars movement, among many other things, is that in a certain way they also combine both. I mean, in certain ways they are populist, but now they appoint all these non-politicians, and say, look, there's going to be a clear, and some of my colleagues have even called this techno-populism, where basically we now say there's one obviously correct solution, goes very much with Grillo at one point saying, look, we're going to put like a housewife with 3 kids in charge of the economics ministry. Because, she's more competent than all these economics professors, because the solution really for what needs to be done for Italy is obvious. So all of a sudden these supposed extremes can even meet in one movement. And everything that, at least I think, should be real democracy, choices, arguments, not making people feel that if they're on the losing side of a conflict, they're un-Italian or unreasonable, or they're basically out of the game, all that disappears in this kind of dynamic. So therefore, why, irrespective of the individual decisions and people, I think it's a dynamic that Europe should avoid, not this kind of technocracy versus populism.
Finally, for this part, it's also, and we talked about it earlier, an urban-rural divide across the world, basically. And more people are moving to the cities in Europe, in the US as well. Does that mean that this problem and the polarization will only increase?
I think it would be far too easy. For example, if you look at Rotterdam, not exactly the countryside.
That's an example, but it isn't.
The populist party is there is already
right.
for many years the largest party.
But it's a
very cosmopolitan city
right.
where many nationalities converge. So it's much too easy to say those are the people living in a different time zone, not catching up with modernity, not understanding the realities of modern urban life.
But isn't Rotterdam an exception, Paul?
Well, Malmö would be another example. I mean, there are many cities where you can find that that they've changed enormously, and that populist parties also have a following in these cities. So yes, of course, they are above average represented outside of larger urban areas, but definitely it's not simply an urban. It is partly, it has to do with lower and higher education, I guess, those divides. But it's too simple, I think, to frame it as an urban countryside phenomenon.
Can I say one more, if I may? Just one more general
Yes,
thing.
that's why we invited you.
Yes, and also maybe to bring out a slight disagreement in an interesting way. So I think there's sometimes been a tendency, not you here tonight, but sometimes among people who react to populism, to kind of fall from one extreme into the other. So from the extreme of saying they're all demagogues, we don't believe a word of what they say, we can always discount, all their policy solutions right away, simplistic, to sort of fall from that extreme into another extreme where all of a sudden politicians in particular start to say they know something about society that nobody else really knows. They know something about, as the cliched phrase then goes, people's real concerns, anxieties, sorrows, and so on. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't discount their election successes, but I think this thought is sometimes based on a kind of misunderstanding of how democratic representation works. It sort of assumes that it's a kind of mechanical reproduction of already existing identities, interests, and the populace finally discovers these identities and interests and brings them into the system. As opposed to what I think is a more plausible understanding, which is to say, democratic representation is a very dynamic process. And in a sense, democracies are designed to enable as many people as possible to make a claim to representation and say, please follow me. If you see yourself like this, I'm going to offer you something plausible. I mean, this goes back to your example of the peace movement. So in that sense, yes, it means something if mobilization works. But it's not quite the same as some sort of objective truth that has now been discovered. If it goes on long enough, yes, it kind of solidifies. So example, people in the US nowadays talk a lot about the Trumpist movement. As far as I can tell, there is no Trumpist movement. Unlike the Tea Party, that was real, that had organizational structures, that was continuous mobilization, whether it was astroturf or more spontaneous, we can debate, but there was a there. Trumpist movement, I don't see that. But if enough other actors keep treating people like, oh, you are a member of the Trumpist movement, or you are the moderate Trump voter, so we'll give you whatever they think they need to do, give you a little bit of racism, some more nationalism, whatever they think then is right, yes, people are going to see themselves that way, and then we might have a Trumpist movement in 50 years, long after Trump is gone. So all I'm trying to say is that there is some room here for creativity. And dare I say, especially some left-wing parties in Europe today have this tendency behind closed doors more or less to say, damn it, it's too bad, that workers nowadays hate foreigners, but that is just the way it is, and the populists have taught us that objective truth. And I think, again, I'm not saying it's all infinitely malleable, clearly it isn't. But it's also not a sort of given objective fact, which now everybody else has to kind of orient themselves around.
We have asked 3 leading young thinkers in Europe to come up with 2 lessons on populism, and I'll invite them on stage one by one. The first is Claudia Chwalisz from France, the author of 2 books that both look at new forms of political engagement and democratic innovations.
My task has been to talk about 2 lessons on populism, so not an easy thing, and I don't have all the answers, but I've chosen to focus on some ideas for solutions, more in terms of some of the underlying causes of populism, namely this sense that people feeling like they don't have a voice to shape things, because quite honestly they often don't. So to begin with, imagine that instead of using your smartphone to write to your friends and communicate and so on, you insisted on still using someone on horseback to send and deliver a message for you. Imagine that instead of using your washing machine, you still washed everything by hand. And imagine if, instead of taking the train or your car or the plane, you still wanted to take a hot air balloon to get across the world. Now, this doesn't really make a lot of sense. Society has changed, technology has advanced, but when it comes to democracy and our democratic institutions, this logic doesn't seem to apply. We still hang on to the basic democratic infrastructure from the late 18th century. Every 4 or 5 years, we go and we queue at a polling station to go and tick a little box beside the name of a person or a party that we like the most, or sometimes just dislike the least. And then in the time between that, we don't really have much of a chance to influence what any of those elected representatives are doing. And so this model made sense during a time where people literally spent days to be able to get together, and news traveled really slowly. But given how society has changed and people are more interconnected than ever before, relationships are more horizontal, society is more open, this doesn't really make sense to limit ourselves as that being the main democratic mechanism for making our collective decisions to solve our problems and to give people a sense of having a voice. If we were to redesign, what would our democratic institutions look like today if we had a blank slate, we knew nothing about elections? Would elected representative democracy be what we came up with to solve our problems today? Now, I don't have the answer, but I personally highly doubt it. So, unfortunately, we don't have the option of starting from a blank slate, but fortunately, there are some politicians and some people thinking about how can we at least start to reshape and rethink our democratic institutions to be more fitting for the 21st century and a better way of solving our collective problems. So I invite you to transplant yourselves with me to Melbourne in 2014. Here, the council was having an election, so, the traditional process took place. There were lots of promises made, and then the councillors got into power, and, well, they couldn't quite fulfill all of their promises because actually not all of that was possible, the budget wasn't there, and so on. So they're not the only politicians to have ever encountered this problem. It might sound like a familiar situation to some of you, but what they did to solve this was unique, and I think a really good example of what we could be trying to do differently. So instead of deciding in a closed room between themselves, right, what shall we do now? They decided to have the Melbourne People's Panel. So what they did was they invited 10,000 people across the city randomly to be part of a panel that would decide on the city's 10-year, $5 billion budget. Amongst the 10,000 people who were invited, around 2,000 people said, oh yeah, I'd like to do this, I'm free on all those dates. And amongst those people, they then chose a smaller group of around 43 people who were, you can't say statistically representative, but who represented a wide cross-section of society in Melbourne. And these people were given an opportunity to meet 6 times over the course of 3 to 4 months. During that time, they were given a chance to learn, what is the budget, how is it set, how does it work, what are the options, and so on. They were given the time to deliberate with one another, based on everything they learned, hearing each other's diverse perspectives, experiences, ideas, and then also the time to draft really concrete, thoughtful, precise recommendations for what should these priorities be. And at the end of this process, they presented in front of the council and the public all of their recommendations. The council then went away for 7 months and they thought about it. They also took in mind all of the kind of stakeholder engagement that they did and the expert opinions and so on. And then they reunited the Melbourne People's Panel as well as the wider public to announce this 10-year, $5 billion plan. So my first lesson here is that these have been tried and trusted examples of giving people a genuine voice in shaping the decisions that affect them, of bringing people together in a way that unites them and focuses on that rather than what divides them. And my second lesson, though, is that even though it's been a good first step, that it's not enough. So these have been mostly ad hoc initiatives, and it really depends on the democratic champions who are the politicians deciding to do these kinds of things. So as soon as they are out of power or the political tide changes, these kinds of things stop. So what we would need is to institutionalize the use of these kind of mechanisms to, on a more permanent basis, give ordinary people a big role in shaping the policies that are affecting them, to give them a voice, to say there is an alternative. So could we not have permanent citizens' assemblies with randomly selected people who rotate, and on different issues there's a different group of people working to solve them?
Thank you very much. May I ask to put some light on the audience, because I like to see whom I'm talking to? Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I don't consider populism as an inherently bad or dangerous phenomenon. In the upcoming 5 minutes, I try to argue for an understanding of populism, where we could see the potential in populism and to repair the undeniable failures of our democracy. Now I'd like to provide you with 3 important characteristics to understand the key factors of the dismantling of liberal democracy in Hungary, the main problem with the politics of the Orban regime, and why I think that only a left-wing populist movement could repair democracy in Hungary and in the European Union. So, Orban's illiberal state. Mr. Orban did not popularize democracy. He privatized it. He wasn't engaged in the involvement of the people. He induced depression, causing them to feel that their will won't matter. The real problem with Orban's illiberal democracy is not that it is illiberal, but rather that it is not a democracy at all. As I mentioned before, liberal democracy failed in many aspects to serve the people in Hungary. So when Orban occupied, destroyed, and undermined fundamental institutions, such as the Supreme Court and the electoral system, he destroyed something which did not have a value in the eyes of the majority of the citizens, simply because they didn't feel that these institutions had served them. So Mr. Orban harmed democracy and the opportunities for self-determination of the people. He restricted the possibility of any referendum. He turned the entire public media into a propaganda channel, depriving people from the access of information, and he destroyed the rudiments of the welfare state and social rights too, making it impossible for most of the people, especially the poor ones, to exercise their basic freedom rights. May I get the picture, please? Maybe you think that I sound like someone who doesn't respect the rule of law or the achievements of the transition. If you think that, then I have to emphasize that less than 200 people demonstrated on the day when the parliament passed the new constitution back in 2011. I know it because I was the organizer of that demonstration. The picture above on the screen was taken on that event. Mr. Orban's biggest lie is this. He promised liberation from the bureaucratic and failed institutions of democracy, but the only thing he delivered in return was nothing less than personal tyranny. The biggest favor you could do to Mr. Orban is to consider him as a populist. He is keen on his appearance as a leader of the masses, but in the meantime he is not connected to the people at all. He is not representing the will of the people, he creates it. But that is not populism. This is demagoguery, and there is a huge difference between the two. This is why populism is somehow a necessity. In my country, most of the people had their shot. This is the widespread belief reinforced by the mainstream media and the decision makers, and they failed. The promise of populism looks like this. If we are united with others who also failed, there is still a chance for us together for another try. In Hungary, in a relatively poor country, we still have the resources to make the necessary correction to turn our actual evil and cruel state into a non-cruel and a non-evil one. But that's just not enough. We are living in an era of populist democracies. The question looks like this: whether there will be a leftist turn in these populist democracies, or the responses to the ongoing tensions and crises in our societies will come only from the right wing. We don't have to give politics to the people. The task is rather to involve them. Thank you very much.
I would like to say, if we manage to fight the right-wing populists in Switzerland, and they are the role model for other right-wing populists abroad, then maybe also this positive case of successfully fighting the right-wing populists can be an inspiration for people abroad. So I chose to show you with this campaign my 2 lessons on how to fight right-wing populists. And the first is how to reframe the issue, to gain back sovereignty of interpretation, I would call it, about the issue, and to be a patriot. And the other case, I will speak to you about becoming a fighter. I think what I understand under this is like to keep calm, be professional, even if the pressure is high. I would also say you just need to get this like bulletproof vest out of arguments and rhetorics to be ready to argue against your political opponent. And still, I would say kill them with kindness, you know. That's what we do. I mean, we don't see ourselves as a, you know, we need to state this, and it's about the discussion, and keep a certain style, but don't be too afraid of, saying straight things. And so, to finish here, why do I think that by what we do with Operation Liberal, we're acting actually for democracy? I think we see ourselves as a translation service somehow of liberal values to why they matter to people. And I think that's a really important issue to do in democracy, to speak about it and to do it in a popular way. I think you can be popular without being populistic in a way. You can find a language that more people understand, and I think that's one of the most important things today.
Thank you so much, Flavia. Kill them with kindness. That's one line to remember. We've heard Márton, we've heard Claudia talk about citizen assembly. Before we go to the audience, finally, I would like Mr. Müller and Paul Scheffer to respond to something particular they heard and they want to respond to. Let's start with Paul Scheffer.
Well, one thing springs to mind listening to all this, and that is new forms of democracy, and especially the referendum. In the Netherlands, we have this long discussion about the referendum. I won't summarize it for you because it's very difficult to understand for people coming from abroad to get a sense why this is lingering on for 30 years in the Netherlands, and we're not able to find new forms of democracy. Even direct election of mayors in cities is impossible in the Netherlands to achieve. But when I understand your speech about the Swiss experience, there I find examples that are, in my understanding, very stimulating and especially suited also for a country like the Netherlands, to find new forms through the referendum, and that you prove, also like in Ireland, that the referendum is not per se the silent majority choosing for the illiberal option. can be different, different outcomes are possible. So that is for me a great lesson, and also a lesson for the Netherlands to learn. So in that sense, it's not only about new forms of politics, but definitely also giving substantial answers in many areas where there is discomfort or worries of citizens that are to be taken seriously, not by withdrawing into the back room and saying all these people who hate foreigners are right. No, but trying to regain a sense of the moral middle ground. And that is being torn apart by people who say, on the one hand, we need closed borders. On the other, the reaction, people saying we need to open borders. We need to reclaim the moral middle ground. And many of these stories reinforce my belief that it's possible.
Thank you so much for coming. The Forum on European Culture will end tomorrow evening, which means there are plenty of more events. Just go to the website. And a special thanks, obviously, to the entire panel. Thank you very much.